And this is not a talk in relation to, what AI is and what AI isn't. I'm sort of assuming that everybody here has at least some understanding, or at least their own perspective, as to actually what AI is and AI isn't. And it is quite fuzzy. So, for example, I know, going back many, many years working with some of my clients, and they would have been talking about, advanced analytics, for example. But when you dug under the hood as to exactly what they were doing, they were actually using AI in the form of machine learning, for example. So, I want to make a few points. First of all, artificial intelligence is not intelligent. And actually, what's always intrigued me is that actually what started out as a field of study in 1956 has somehow today become a technology. How did that happen? Yeah, in 1956, a group of essentially researchers and scholars came together at Dartmouth University to spend the summer looking to see if they could design a machine that could think, that could learn, essentially that could exhibit kind of human-like intelligence. And it was made up of people from computer science, from cognitive science, from psychology, from economics, kind of a multidisciplinary group of people. And it was out of that the phrase artificial intelligence was actually coined. It's not sentinel either, despite what you might read. And this is what your AI girlfriend looks like without makeup. Yeah? At the end of the day, it's a technology. Yeah, it's a piece of technology. It's got particular capabilities that we might dig into later on. Has anybody seen this book? Or indeed, has anybody read this book? The Rise of the Expert Company. Have you seen this book? And the subtitle is How Visionary Companies Are Using Artificial Intelligence to Achieve Higher Productivity and Profits. Anybody read the book? Have you come across it? Anybody any idea when it was published? Well, let me read you a quote from the book. It says, and I've got it actually highlighted as well. Any senior manager in any business of almost any size who isn't at least learning about AI and sticking a tentative toe or two into AI's waters is simply out of step, dangerously slow. This is a book that was published in 1988. So you can imagine the publication cycle. It was based on research that was done, probably 86, 87. 40 years ago. What's different? Stick a tentative toe. So AI has been around for a long, long time. Yeah? And again, I think one of the questions I'd like to kind of dig into it with the panelists is, what's different now? Why now? Why are we having the conversation about AI today that maybe we didn't have 40 years ago, although companies were using AI. And if you look at the list of companies, Toyota, how they're using it, American Express, Digital Equipment Corporation, how pioneering companies were looking to harness the capabilities of technology. Let's look at some research. And what's research actually showing us? I'm going to look at two studies, and these are two quite large-scale studies in terms of large ends. This is a study that was undertaken in the UK in the public sector by the Department of Science, Innovation and Technology. It was a survey of 20,000 employees that were using Microsoft 365 Copilot. And they were surveyed in terms of, the frequency of use and the time savings, et cetera. One of the interesting findings, users reported an average of 26 minutes saved per day. So they were saying, actually, I'm using Copilot, I really like it, it's saving me time. And again, we're going to, in the panel, one of the questions I have is, what people often report they save, but actually when you dig in, it often tells a different story. But look at what some of the constraints, the limitations, struggle to deal with complex data, especially at work requiring nuance and context. And again, and it also wasn't possible to look at, what was that time saved used for? But a subsequent study, this was 1,000 licenses, again another UK government department, again Microsoft 365, and look at the bottom line. Yeah, what they found was that there was not robust evidence that the time saved found its way essentially into the P&L. So there was no actually productivity gains. So just think about it. So everybody was saying that was surveyed, I really like the tool, I'm using it, it's saving me 26, 29 minutes per day, but actually that wasn't really finding its way into productivity uplift. So we have this paradox. So we're seeing companies pouring, particularly over the last 2 years, billions into AI and not seeing the payoff. We're not seeing the impact, particularly on the P&L. So it's not hitting the P&L. This is a really interesting study that was done last September by the Financial Times. And what they did was they looked at the quarterly filings, the SEC, the take-in, the 10K filings of largest companies in the US that were quoted on the stock exchange. And they also analyzed the investor transcripts of the CFO talking to the investor community. And what their conclusion was, again, this is the biggest listed companies in the US, that they're talking about AI, okay, but none of them are able to describe how the technology is changing their business for the better. So everybody's talking about it. But actually, we're not seeing lots and lots of examples follow through. And again, with the panelists, particularly with Prague and Cullen, again, I'll kind of be probing how their organizations are harnessing the capabilities of AI. And again, we see this kind of conundrum is that CEOs say AI is making work more efficient, but actually when you survey employees in their companies, it tells a different story. Yeah, so again, a bit of a disconnect of what the CEOs of these companies are saying versus what employees are reporting. But this productivity paradox, it's not new. If we go back to the 1980s, 1981, the IBM PC appeared. 1984, the Apple Mac. In the 1980s, companies were investing heavily in technology, particularly investing in PCs. And in a review of a book that was titled Manufacturing Matters, MIT economist Robert Solow, he actually wrote the words, "You can see the computer age everywhere, except in the productivity statistics." So basically what he was saying was, as he looked around, organizations, as he visited companies, he was seeing lots and lots of PCs, lots and lots of computer technology, but that wasn't being reflected in the productivity statistics. It was a similar situation back in the 70s. In the 70s, we had automation coming into factories. So in the 80s, the concern was with the white-collar workers and what was going to happen. They were all going to be displaced and replaced by computers. In the 1970s, it was the factories, the automation, it was the robots that were coming into factories that were going to displace the blue-collar worker. So this conversation about worker displacement, again, it seems to accompany every technology. It was the same with the internet. So anybody, any idea? So when did we start to see an uplift in productivity? And more importantly, do you have any idea or any sense of what was the driver of that? What might have driven the uplift in productivity, particularly in the 1990s? No. Sorry? Internet? No. The internet is just a technology. Laptops just a technology. These are just technologies. Better. This is my view. It was the emergence of what became known as business process re-engineering. Yeah, business process re-engineering, which was introduced to the world by Mike Hammer in a 1990 Harvard Business Review article. Okay, and the thesis of process re-engineering is all about not just overlaying technology on existing work practices, on existing workflows, but to look for opportunities to harness the capabilities of technology to reimagine processes, to reimagine workflows. And it was as a result of companies embracing what became known as BPR, business process re-engineering, that we begun to see an uplift in productivity improvement. And that's sort of the same sort of conversation that we're having today in relation to AI, particularly in the context of agentic AI. It's all about the workflows, the processes, the reimagining of those processes. And just look at some of the kind of the phraseology that Mike used. Again, remember, this is back in 1990. Okay, he's talking about the fact that companies leave existing processes intact and use computers simply to speed them up. He talks about it's time to stop paving the cowpaths. Instead of embedding outdated processes in silicon and software, we should obliterate them and start over. Re-engineering strives to break away from the old rules about how we organize and conduct business. It involves recognizing and rejecting some of them and then finding imaginative new ways to accomplish work. And that's what we're saying about agentic AI. That's where I believe the real value is going to come. Okay, you're going to get some value from your conversational chatbot. Yeah, but the real benefit will come when it's embedded in organizational processes. And there might be kind of an analogy that might help you think about this. If you look at when ATMs appeared, 1979, first ATM, 1978, 1979, first ATMs appeared, we didn't see a reduction in tellers. Yeah, so banks actually didn't suddenly get rid of, close down branches, the teller population. No, because, you still had to go into a bank, if you wanted to transfer money. It was only useful in terms of you want to check your balance or you wanted to take out cash. But for most banking transactions, you still needed a bank. But it was only with the advent of mobile, 2008, particularly Apple and then smartphones, we saw the emergence of kind of these neo-banks, the likes of kind of Starling, Monzo, Revolut. I mean, that meant that we didn't need to go into a bank. We could transact in a fundamentally different way. And as a consequence of that, we then begun to see, as the processes were reimagined, a decline in the number of tellers as banks closed branches. But it's not easy. Even if we look at a company like Salesforce, who try to present themselves as sort of pioneers with agent force, when they talk about having lots and lots of agents on their platform, what they've done is they're rethinking their reliance on large language models after encountering reliability issues in real-world business use. Because we know large language models hallucinate, which is sort of a polite term for saying it makes stuff up. And that's a bit of a problem. Now, that doesn't mean they're not using AI, but they're using what we might call good old-fashioned AI, i.e. machine learning. So there is intelligence in the platform, it's just not generative AI. Elon Musk, 2015, he said, and this is again a quote from a conference that he spoke at, we're going to end up with complete autonomy, and I think we'll have complete autonomy in approximately 2 years. Okay, that was 2015. Okay. Here's Geoffrey Hinton, 2016, a year later. Geoffrey Hinton is often described as one of the godfathers of AI. He worked for many years as a computer science professor at the University of Toronto, and then he went and worked for Google for many, many years. This is just a short snippet of a kind of a question and answer session at a conference in 2016. Listen to what he has to say about radiologists, okay? And particularly focus on how he prefaces what he says. A few things seem obvious, okay? And this is from the godfather of AI.
So, Jeff, perhaps a similar question, if you may. What do you think is some of this exciting work to come?
Okay, so, sorry. Let me start by just saying a few things that seem obvious. I think if you work as a radiologist, you're like the coyote that's already over the edge of the cliff, but hasn't yet looked down, so doesn't realize there's no ground underneath him. People should stop training radiologists now. It's just completely obvious that within 5 years, deep learning is going to do better than radiologists, because it's going to be able to get a lot more experience. It might be 10 years, but we've got plenty of radiologists already. I said this at a hospital, and it didn't go down too well, but there you go. There's going to be thousands of applications of the deep learning technology we currently have, especially stuff using fast chips, to thousands of applications, and hundreds of them are going to work, and those are the ones you're going to hear about. So there'll be lots of that. And I think of that now as business as usual. Take any old problem where you have to predict something, and you have a lot of data, and deep learning is probably going to make it work better than the existing techniques. Sorry?
Okay, so that was 10 years ago. Yeah, a few things seem obvious. There is a traffic jam, and somewhere there is a radiologist stuck in an ordinary car, and he's driving it, him or herself. Okay, so again, we get the point I'm trying to make here is that we often read, particularly, let's say something that somebody like Geoffrey Hinton says, and we said, oh, this is going to be a disaster. If I'm a radiologist, or you're maybe advising a kid about what college course should they maybe pursue, and you might say, well, don't do radiology because in 5 years' time there's going to be no need for radiologists. So before we get into the panel, I just want to maybe share some words of caution. This is from the Stanford Emerging Technology Review of 2025. So again, a lot of these tech AI companies come out of Stanford. So this is quite an authoritative, it's an annual publication. And this again is just a kind of a sentence from this particular review last year. What they say again about AI, despite rapid progress in the past several years, even the most advanced AI still has many failure modes that are unpredictable, not widely appreciated, not easily fixed, not explainable, and capable of leading to unintended consequences. Pretty damning. And here we have Andrew Nye, who led Google Brain. He's the co-founder of Coursera and is also a Stanford professor. And again, this is just at an event there last December where he says, technology is limited and won't replace humans anytime soon. So sort of despite the sort of the gloom in those headlines in last Sunday's Sunday Business Post, it was actually quite revealing and quite pleasant to read Ezra Klein's piece in New York Times last week, where he's talked about the AI job apocalypse probably won't happen. So let me finish off, because AI, without a doubt, particularly in the last 3 years, has been getting a lot of attention. And what we see organizations do, one of the kind of the knee-jerk reactions is often to hire somebody and give them a responsibility for whatever the technology is, AI. So what we have, particularly in respect of technology, we seem to have, or we seem to be accumulating an alphabet soup of technology roles. Just think about it. Chief Information Officer, Chief Technology Officer, Chief Data Officer, Chief Digital Officer, Chief Analytics Officer, and now Chief AI Officer. I sort of wonder, what do they do? Yeah, and where do they hit upon each other? And then the other kind of prescription that has been very, very strong is for companies to have and develop an AI strategy. And I wrote a piece last year in the Wall Street Journal where I sort of cautioned against that. And I sort of wondered, is that AI strategy to sit beside your data strategy, your IoT strategy, your internet strategy, you name it, your digital strategy? What's the difference between a digital strategy and an AI strategy? Yeah, but again, it sort of gives the sense we're doing something, we're making progress. We've got a leader now who is responsible for this thing, this technology. Yeah, we've got a strategy. I think that might be part of the problem. So this is kind of my view, is that I think that conversational chatbots, the likes of ChatGPT, Copilot, Claude, will become just normal technology. Yeah, so you start a new job, you get your laptop, and it's loaded with Word, Excel, PowerPoint, and some intelligent assistant that will probably make lots and lots of mistakes. Yeah. And what about agentic AI? And what about productivity improvements? When I was doing my doctorate over 30 years ago, myself and one of my fellow doctoral students, a guy called Phil Rowland, we had a little side project. So we were doing our research for our doctorate, but we had a little side project around business process reengineering. And we ended up actually writing one of the first books on business process reengineering in the early 1990s. Phil decided that he didn't want to pursue an academic career, so he actually, as soon as we actually wrote the last chapter, he left the business school. I was at Cranfield School of Management. He actually joined McKinsey's, became a partner in McKinsey's, and is now in private equity. So we've exchanged a few emails over the years. We haven't actually met up in over 30 years until about 3 weeks ago. So we met up. He happened to be in Dublin doing some business, and we were just talking about the book. And we were just reminiscing on writing the book, but he made the point that actually all of the stuff that we were writing about over 30 years ago is still very, very, very relevant today, to the extent that he suggested that maybe we might, 32, 33 years later, write a second edition. You know, we talked about the productivity paradox under a section called the IT black hole. And I was delighted when I actually went back to the book. We even have a section on AI. So even back then we were talking about AI, and I was even more impressed when I read that we were talking back then about neural networks.